As I mentioned before, my name is Chris Buchanan. I'm the chairman of the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. And today we're here to talk about a warrant article proposal that we discussed at the previous Board of Selectmen meeting. Our committee has since had a meeting, and there was a workshop as well. And we have refined our language a bit and also solidified our rationale and at least our stance on why we think particular options might be better. So just to run through the thought process that went through here, this is the article that was submitted. It's in the agenda packet. I'm not going to just read it right now. I just brought it up here as an example, but I will come back to it afterwards. So this article really seeks to do two specific things. The first one is to establish a capital reserve fund, similar to how we have capital reserve funds for fire engines or for the communication center. These are established funding mechanisms that are just in place. And then when projects arise, then an article or something like that could raise money for a particular project and just use this capital reserve fund as just a mechanism. So it would allow for the funding of specific projects, but also to take funding that has been raised and utilize that funding to find cost-effective opportunities, whether it be to conduct a project during road construction or during a federal grant or something like that. The second thing that this article seeks to do is, as it's written right now, it would raise $75,000 and place it into said capital reserve fund, specifically for the Boston Post Road School Campus Sidepath project. By raising $75,000, it would raise 1/3 of the estimated project cost, but it would also, very importantly, create the opportunity to fund possibly that entire project in 2021 by funding a 20% match for the TAP grant, which I'll discuss shortly. Specifically, the way that this article is written, it wouldn't preclude us from particular eligibility issues that we would have with the TAP grant. So I'll just mention that in a moment. So the project that we're looking at to fund the Boston Post Road School Campus Sidepath, when we select a project, we're really just trying to balance a few different things. One of them is we don't just pick random projects. We're trying to find cost-effective opportunities, balance it with contributing to a town-wide network, and then established, usually database needs such as volume, our survey that we conducted in 2018, and things like that. So what in the middle there's priority projects that we can find to help us decide which ones to advance. So this one is well established. On the left there, you'll see the 2013 Safe Routes to School report, which identified this area as a priority project to have multimodal facilities alongside the street. It's frequently used. I probably don't need to describe the situation very much because if you live in Amherst, you've seen this, and it's a pretty known situation. So just a little bit of the data behind it. The 2018 survey that I just mentioned, obviously the most requested project was the Boston Post Road area and specifically the school campuses. Furthermore, when I take a look at the volume that we have of our streets, the municipal streets, that is, this area is the second highest volume that we have in the town, only to Amherst Street. So, okay, that's the project idea. But if you'll recall, road construction occurred somewhat recently along Boston Post Road. And that means that the typical cost-effective opportunity that we would go for, which is trying to build facilities concurrently with road construction, we're not afforded that opportunity, unfortunately. So there are other things that we can do to try to mitigate the cost of such a project. The estimated project cost is $225,000. There is still more information that we're trying to attain. I know that cost per linear foot of the Amherst Street project, for example, was less because of it being done with road construction. And then there's some additional engineering complications of this particular project that drive the cost up a little bit, including the need to survey. There's a water crossing near, was it Cross Road and Stearns Road in between. The right-of-way gets very narrow in the same area, and as a result, there would likely need to be grade separation, so there would have to be likely a curb or something along those lines. And then the crossing at Cross Road would be needed to be upgraded likely. So if we take a look at what that project would cost, we've got, just for reference, the Amherst Street project is in green. That's our last year warrant article at $287,500. This project is a little bit less expensive. And then for reference, a comparable neighboring town's sidewalk project is a bit more. When you compare that to the length of the project, you'll see that the cost per linear foot really matters a lot, and how, in particular, the Amherst Street project was just a very cost-effective opportunity. This one is less so, as road construction is not happening. Carrying on. So when we try to figure this out, we have a project. First thing we ask, is there road construction? If there is, great. But if there's not, then the next thing that we come to is grant funding, because there's not many other ways to save money on these sorts of things. So in this case, there is grant funding possibility in front of us. And as we've discussed at previous Board of Selectmen meetings, the only way to really effectively apply to a grant is to have your match prepared in advance. It is possible to still get a grant without doing that, but it's very likely that your application will be discarded as you have not demonstrated that you have the capacity to raise your matching portion. So that's a very important factor when we're going forward. So in this case, rather than raising funds conventionally, that's kind of our plan B, which this warrant article would do. It would raise 1/3 of the project cost. We can also leverage that money in a higher priority, which would be to try to get a grant. So the grant that I keep referring to is the Transportation Alternatives Program. It only occurs every other year. But because of coronavirus, it didn't happen this year. So it'll have been 3 years since it was last administered. So right now, we've tried to find out when it will be specifically and other details about it. Rick Katzenberg, the vice chair of our committee, even went as far as contacting U.S. Congress representatives that we have to try to get answers to this, and we were not able to get a clear picture as to when the grant will occur. But in all likelihood, as they've skipped 2020, it will most likely be 2021. It's an 80-20 grant program. And then importantly, for our consideration here tonight, this grant has project minimums. So in 2018, it had a $400,000 minimum project cost. And if you have a project that is less than that, they will either encourage you, well, they will reject your application, first of all, but it's common practice to try to incorporate some other project in order to meet that minimum threshold, so long as it is of the same character. So that's typically what happens with the TAP grant. So taking a look at how we can leverage funding for just the maximum cost saving here. When we take a look at this conventional funding for the project, let's assume that road construction will never happen and no grant will ever happen. Conventional funding would be $225,000 of municipal monies would have to be raised in order to cover the cost of the project. If there were road construction, then the 60% reduction in cost could make the project cost only $90,000. That may be a familiar number for those who recall the Safe Routes to School project, as in anticipation of upcoming road construction back then in 2013. That was the number entertained by the then DPW director as the potential project cost in upcoming road construction, which is now in the past. I'm not sure I phrased that very clearly, but nevertheless, going forward, if we were to get an 80-20 grant, the municipal contribution would be $45,000 raised with $180,000 to meet the total project cost. But as I mentioned, the minimum project cost of the TAP grant in 2018 was $400,000, which poses a problem as this project is less than $400,000. Either way, by raising a certain amount of money, especially if it's in the ballpark of the 20% of $400,000, then it would create the eligibility for us to apply for a grant for this project. It is possible if that were to happen, then we would have to look to one of our other projects to try to come up with gap funding or something like that. But the point here is to raise money specifically for this project, and that the TAP grant is likely the best opportunity in order to mitigate municipal cost. So this is the federal portion here. There's a clearer graph right here. So in an 80-20 grant, assuming there's a $400,000 minimum project cost, the school campus project would amount to $45,000 of the $80,000 required on the municipal side. And as a result, we would get $180,000 of federal funds to complete that project, raising the $225,000 necessary as estimated to complete that project. But we would also be left with a gap where we would have to come up with some alternate projects, perhaps some of the other ones that we've discussed with the Board of Selectmen in the past. I'm not sure. Nevertheless, that's what that would look like. So coming back to the article, in general, it seeks to create a capital reserve fund, similar to how we raise money for fire engines or the like, that the fund is, it's there long-term, and each year or whenever there's a project, the project in question would be the point of discussion to raise an allotted amount of money to place into that capital reserve fund. And in this case, the project that we're seeking to do is the Boston Post Road School campus area. And by having the warrant article written in this particular way, it affords us the opportunity to communicate the project as the purpose of the monies. The Board of Selectmen would be the agents of the fund, and so the Board of Selectmen could uphold the intent of the monies that are placed in there by selecting only to utilize that money for that project or in contribution with another project, so long as it completes the project, etc. But importantly, the way that this article is written does not preclude us from the possibility of trying to come up with some other way that we can meet that minimum threshold for a 2021 grant. So that's, I believe, the gist of it all. We're trying to find a way to fund the project, to create grant opportunities next year, but also to establish a predictable infrastructure funding mechanism. And it's our belief that this warrant article strikes that balance with those various priorities. And I think that's the end. It is. All right.